Hey guys, BuildZoid here, and so this is just going to be a video rambling about 11th gen and 10th gen and Z590, because, yeah, like, this is gonna sort of, I want this to set the tone for the PCB breakdowns of the Z590 motherboards, because I got really, really, really excited for all the Z590, like for Z590 motherboards, because we've got so many great Z590 boards coming out. We've got things like the Maximus 13 Apex, the Aorus Tachyon, the ASRock OC Formula, and so we've got there's also probably going to be an MSI Z590 Unify X, which is like MSI's take on an extreme overclocking board, and I'm super excited for these like really overclocking focused boards. And then if you're into, more like if you don't care about having like a keyboard worth of buttons on your motherboard, there's also boards like the Z590 Aorus Ultra where, you've got a postcode, you've got a safe boot function, very solid VRM. Like, yeah, this is a great board in my opinion. Like they basically took the Z490 Master and like this is actually better than the Z490 Master in the VRM department, and then just like added a safe boot button to it, which I think is awesome. Um, anyway, so yeah, so you've got boards like this, and then also from MSI you have the Z590 Gaming Force if for whatever reason you don't like the Z590 Aorus Ultra. Um, and so we've got all these amazing boards. In fact, I'd go as far as saying that Z590 as a chipset has the best selection of motherboards of any chipset ever. But man, the CPUs. Like, I know I did a video about how the 11900K is amazing on LN2 overclock, like for LN2 benching, and how it's extremely competitive in the hardware bot rankings. But at the end of the day, if I was building a system with a Intel CPU, which I still think is reasonable because there are scenarios where Intel still has an advantage against, AMD Ryzen chips. There's very few of them. But, like the other thing is like a 5600X is pretty damn expensive. A 5800X is pretty damn expensive. So, like I'd say, 10th gen Intel chip versus 5000 series Ryzen chip, it's not as simple as going always AMD or always Intel, because you can basically get like an 8 core or a 10 core Intel for the price of a 6 core or 8 core AMD, right? Which is kind of ridiculous to think about. But the 11th gen chips at ambient are just awful. Like they are just awful. Because you have less L3 cache, you have more memory latency, you have like bigger cores that run hotter, but there's less of them. So, like if you read any reviews, like I went and checked a bunch of reviews to make absolutely certain, because like my init, like there's a couple sites that I rely on for reviews, but this time, I wanted to make sure that it wasn't just like my preferred sources weren't really biased against 11th gen, and it's like, no, like everybody agrees 11th gen is just very mediocre. It like the only time it's an actual major upgrade over a 10900K is in AVX 512 accelerated workloads, but I'd argue you should just be looking at like Intel HEDT if you want AVX 512 acceleration, because that's kind of what X299 was designed for, especially considering that AVX 512 as an instruction set is normally very memory intensive. So you probably want a quad channel CPU, It's just like, so that's kind of the thing, is just like the 11900K doesn't make sense as a daily CPU at all, especially with the pricing. And I know it's not supposed to be $837, but even Intel themselves are like, yeah, this should be like a $550 CPU. And my response to Intel is like, well, this doesn't really have a whole lot of overclocking headroom. In fact, this clocks even worse than a 10900K on average. The average 10900K, if you're going for like full Lin pack, Prime 95 and Prime 95 stability, you should be hitting 5.1 gigahertz on average. If you're doing the same with an 11900K, even if you disable the AVX 512 instructions, because if you keep those enabled, the chip runs so much hotter, like way hotter. So you can disable the AVX 512 instructions, but even if you disable the AVX 512 instructions, an 11900K does not outclock a 10900K. It just doesn't, and it pulls the same amount of power. that's probably why it doesn't outclock it, right? And so the thing is, you can have like a 5 gigahertz 8 core on average with full AVX stability, or you can have a 5.1 gigahertz 10 core on average with full AVX stability. And it's like, well, that doesn't seem like a very difficult question, considering the 10 core is also freaking cheaper, right? Like, you can have a 10900K from Best Buy for $460. Actually, even if you were buying it for $500 from Amazon, it's still cheaper than the MSRP for an 11900K, which incidentally you can't even get at that price. Like, why would you buy an 11900K? This is a dumb CPU. But it gets worse because the 11900KF exists, so if you don't need the iGPU, you can save a bit more money. So again, like, yeah, there's also the 11900KF, but the 10900KF is like this is cheaper. It's still cheaper. And you will have the 11700K, which is now cheaper than the thing with the 11700K is this is going to be on average clocking even worse than an 11900K, right? And the 11900K already isn't exactly a clock speed champion by any means because big cores don't clock very far. It's not a new thing, right? Like, that's not really a new thing, though technically you can make large cores which are designed to clock really, really high, but usually the way that works is you trade all of your IPC for clock speed and then you end up with a bulldozer. So Intel's 11900K, like it's really not a bulldozer, right? Like I've seen a lot of people compare it to AMD FX, but it's like it's nowhere near as bad as Bulldozer was. Bulldozer was really, really bad. But the thing is, like, the 11900K just isn't competitive with the 10900K or the 10900KF. The 11700K is like, well, okay, that's an 8 core, but it's like you could have a 10850K instead. And these will probably have a similar clock speed like trade-off that you have between the 10900K and 11900K and the 10900K, where this is on average going to do 5.1, this is probably going to do 5, assuming you're going all-core AVX stability. 11700K versus 10850K, I would assume 4.9 average versus 5 average, because the 10850K is like bidding rejects from the 10900K bin, and I would assume on average they're like 100 megahertz worse. It might be more than that. It could be 200 megahertz worse, which there's also a decent chance that's also the case for the 11700K, because that is a big difference in the boost clock right there, right? Like there's less of a difference in the boost clock for a 10850K and a 10900K than there is in the boost clock of a 11700K and an 11900K. Also, the fact that it looks like you can actually get 1100Ks at $400. I'm guessing Intel is having a serious problem getting silicon in good enough quality to make 11900Ks. Which probably tells you that the it's like, oh yeah, these are available because they have a lot of bidding rejects, right? That's why you can buy these, but can't buy those. Which is like, well, that's not really confidence inspiring when it comes to the silicon quality, right? So, yeah, this might be anywhere from like a little bit worse than, 11700Ks could be anywhere from like a little bit worse than 11900Ks on average to a lot worse than 11900Ks on average. I'd say it's not going to be 300 megahertz, like you have the gap in the boost. I don't think it's going to be quite that big, but I would be not surprised if it was 100 or even 200 megahertz on average, that the 11700K just doesn't clock as high. And that's not helping anything, because the funny thing is, at stock, an 11900K doesn't consistently beat a 10900K. Which is like, so not only do we have a performance disadvantage at stock clocks, overclocked a 10900K is probably going to end up at a higher core clock. That's not great. Like that's really not where you want to be. And the thing is, like, yeah, there's workloads where the 11900K does well, but I'd say most people are buying Intel chips for gaming. And there's a lot of games where the 10900K is just, like, faster than an 11900K. There's also games where the 11900K is faster than the 10900K, but that's where the 10900K can make up some of the difference in the fact that it clocks better. Also, the 10900K has a lower latency memory controller that you can get to significantly, like, on the 10900K, you can, run much more aggressive memory set. Well, the thing is, the 11900K will run absolutely. It's kind of the Gear 1 to Gear 2 thing between Intel and AMD is kind of interesting in that it's not like Intel's Gear 1, Gear 2 thing is not exactly like AMD's 2-to-1 and 1-to-1 FCLK ratio. Because the biggest penalty on AMD is not from the underclocking of the memory controller, it's from the desynchronization with the Infinity Fabric. Where, like, because even if you're in 1-to-1 ratio, you can desync the Infinity Fabric and your performance falls off a cliff. Whereas on Intel, you don't have there's no synchronization ever. In 2-to-1 mode, the memory controller just gets slower, which is why a 11900K running in 2-to-1 mode ultimately still is capable of lower memory latencies than like Ryzen chips are. But then Ryzen chips are in 2-to-1 mode. But they also, like, 11th gen chips, like, is a higher latency memory system than what you get on a 10900K, and this has more L3 cache, right? So actually, I recently saw some really great, like, overclocked 10900K versus 11900K comparisons with, like, dialed-in memory settings that just confirmed my suspicions. I'll leave a link in the description. I already posted a link to that in the community tab on YouTube. Because my suspicion from the get-go was like, okay, so if you actually overclock both of these, the 10900K has a cache advantage, a memory latency advantage, and it should also have a slight clock speed advantage on average. Like, you're going to go from, like, the 11900K, trading blows with the 10900K to the 10900K being consistently better. And it's just like, so... Like, there's no scenario, like, unless you need AVX 512 acceleration, the 11th gen is completely bloody pointless at ambient, as far as I'm concerned. And the pricing doesn't help. But anyway, so you've got your 10850K, and so 11700K, you're giving up even more clock speed on your 11th gen chip, which is just like, yeah, that's exactly what you want to do. There's a decent chance the memory controllers on the 11700Ks are worse than on the 11900Ks, which is like, well... Yeah, that's exactly what you need when you have less L3 cache, right? Because the whole reason, like, if you look at Ryzen CPUs and their massive 32 megabyte blob of L3 cache, it's like the reason why AMD has that giant pile of cache is because they have a really high latency memory system. And the best workaround for that is to have a lot of cache. But with 11th gen, Intel went from having 20 megabytes of L3 cache on a 10900K with a very fast memory, with a very low latency memory controller, to having like a mid latency memory controller, because it's not as bad as your Ryzen memory controllers just yet, but there's less cache now. So the latency's gone up, the cache quantity's gone down, and and it's no wonder that it's losing in certain games at stock settings, right? Like, well, yeah, if your memory latency bound, this isn't the CPU for you. And then, the 11700K might just exaggerate those issues further by being lower quality silicon. But anyway, so yeah, 10850K, great price. But you know what's even crazier? You have like the 10900 and the 10900F, especially the 10900F. You can spend $350 to get a 10-core Intel chip. And the crazy thing is, like, even compared to AMD right now, that is a really, really good deal. Because if we go through the available in AMD CPUs, and I don't want Threadrippers, I just want AM4. So... where's the 5600X? Oh, of course, the 5600X is eternally out of stock. Anyway, so the 5600X is like $300. For $50 more, you can have a 10-core. Now, admittedly, it doesn't have overclocking support, but this is a 10900K, and 10900. And with the 10900 or the 10900F, you can enable multi-core enhancement, which disables the power limit, and you get, like, basically the same all-core turbo as a 10850K or 10900K. Like, the chip is going to be running, like, over 4.5 gigahertz constantly, all the time. And then, of course, you still have the low latency memory system of a regular 10900K. Like, if you stuck a 10900F into a like $200 Z490 motherboard or Z590 motherboard, and then just dialed in your memory settings, that's going to give you a very, very, like, it's a freaking 10 core. Like, you still have a ton of multi-threaded performance. And it's not like the CPU is running particularly slowly with multi-core enhancement enabled. Also, you can overclock the BCLK since Skylake, actually. Um, because with Skylake, Intel disconnected the BCLK from the like PCIe and SATA. So basically, since Skylake, you can run almost arbitrary BCLK on the K chips. Because Intel, of course, realized when they decoupled, like split off the BCLK from the rest of your I/O, for the sake of improving, like for making it possible to overclock the BCLK more. They realized that that would unfortunately allow non-K CPUs to overclock, which is not okay because you have to pay if you want to overclock. So Intel did implement a lock where you cannot raise the BCLK on a non-K CPU above 103 megahertz. If you try to do that, it'll just not post. But what that means is you can still, run like 102.5 BCLK on a 10900F with multi-core enhancement enabled. So that gives you another 2.5% more core clock. And, that doesn't sound like a lot, but if you're stacking up a bunch of little small percentage improvements, at the end of it, you might get something like 10, like a 10% improvement overall, and that's actually somewhat significant. And so right now, it's kind of like sweet spot, if you're just doing a sort of gaming build, 10900F, good, like solid, like motherboard with solid power delivery. Because the thing is, when you disable the multi-core when you enable the multi-core enhancement on a 10900F, its power, like, it starts pulling a lot of power, right? So you do still want a pretty capable motherboard. Then you bump up the BCLK and you dial in your memory settings to say like 4266 CL16 or maybe 4400 CL17 or something like that. You're going to have an extremely capable gaming system out of that, right? You could also use a B560 motherboard to do that, but I've not been paying attention much to the B560 boards. I'd probably. Like, the thing is, the high-end B560 boards are almost the same price as, like, your low-end Z590s, so it's like, maybe someday you'll stumble across a cheap 10900K or something. Which, I don't know. Well, actually, that's very unlikely, because best CPU in socket is normally, ends up... Like, the best CPU in any socket tends to have a bit of a price premium to it on the second-hand market, because there's obviously more motherboards that the CPU fits into than there are CPUs, But anyway, so yeah, 10900F currently is like ridiculous value if you know how to set it up, which it really should just be like MC. You don't even have to do the BCLK thing, in my opinion. Not that there's any risk to it. Like, seriously, you can on a K CPU without the BCLK limiter that Intel has. You can run like 150 BCLK and it's completely fine, or even 200 BCLK. It doesn't really it doesn't cause any issues. So yeah, it's just on the non-K chips, you can't go that far because Intel won't let you, but you can still, add a bit more performance by raising the BCLK, enabling MCE, and then get fast RAM, and bam, you've got yourself, probably like 99% of the performance, like, well, not 99, but like very close to the same level of performance of like an overclocked 10900K, right? So... yeah, anyway, so 10900F is just like ridiculously good deal from that perspective. And then we've got CPUs like the 10700K, which is, look, you can get an 8-core Intel for like the same price as a 6-core AMD. And it's not like the 10th gen chips are slow compared to 5000 series. Like, yes, 5000 series is currently the hands down best gaming CPUs out there at stock settings. With an overclock, depending on the workload, Intel can actually win. Because like what carries Ryzen's in a lot of gaming workloads is the massive L3 cache, whereas on Intel, because you don't have that much cache, you do kind of have to push the memory. Like, I know it's everybody says Intel is less dependent on memory overclocking, but that's just because, like, the thing with Intel memory overclocking is that it's very easy to raise the memory frequency and actually reduce your memory performance because of how the memory controller behaves at high frequencies. if you just keep raising the clock speed, a lot of the time you'll start losing performance up in the higher frequency ranges. And so if you don't know what you're doing on Intel chips, if you just keep, like, if you do a basic test of just raising the frequency and seeing if it improves gaming performance, past like 4,000 megahertz, it probably won't. You'll actually probably start seeing, depending on the motherboard, you might start seeing like a performance reduction because of how the memory controller behaves. If you don't know how to set up everything manually, yeah, like the high frequency XMP kits don't behave very well at stock settings. But if you do dial in your Intel, like if you dial in the memory on an Intel CPU properly, it behaves a lot like with Ryzen, where if you just dial in your memory settings, you get, a bunch of extra performance. And on Intel, it can potentially be even more because Intel is, working with less L3 cache, so it's more dependent on the memory access speed than AMD is. Like AMD's CPUs basically do everything in their power to not have to access the memory because the Infinity Fabric is pretty slow. So anyway, so yeah, then you've got like 10700K, 10700KF, 10700 for $273, 10700F for $270. Like, yeah, you can have an 8-core Intel chip for less than a 6-core Ryzen. And again, with the 10700F, enable MCE, bump the 10700F does have a low, boost clock. So here I'd say the argument is less. It's not as good as with the 10900F. Like the 10900F is 100 megahertz away from the 5.3 of a 10900K or 10900KF. Whereas a 10700K is actually 5.1 gigahertz compared to the 4.8 of a 10700F, but that's still going to be a very, very solid CPU, especially at this price point. And so finally we get an 11600K, and it's just like, I guess if you're playing something that's very, very single-threaded, the 11600K might actually offer an advantage over a 10700F or, well, 10700F. I'd say the 10700K is a little bit too expensive to be compared to the 11600K, but yeah. So this is like the only Intel chip in the the only 11th gen chip that makes any sense because it's just like it avoids being about like it's it's at a reasonable, like the price is kind of okay. But also 11600Ks don't really clock that great from what I've seen. Because again, like I think Intel, I think this is Intel binning 11900Ks to like the absolute limit of what the chips will do. Because it like either the process, because here's the thing, like the 11th gen is still built on 14 nanometer, but the cores are bigger. Right? The cores are bigger and they have more IPC. Under most circumstances, bigger cores with more IPC should be clocking worse than smaller cores with less IPC. So, and we kind of see that, right? 11700K, 5 gigahertz max boost. 10700K, 5.1. I wonder why that is. The 11900K is the exception, where it's like 5.3 versus 5.3. But then again, they apparently can't make these fast enough. So that makes me suspect that these are kind of hard to produce, and 11th gen just like it really shouldn't be clocking as high as 10th gen because that it's bigger. Unless they made some major, further large improvements to 14 nanometer, 11th gen shouldn't be able to clock as high as 10th gen. And looking at most of the SKUs, it really looks like that's the case, right? Except for 10600K is 4.8 gigahertz. So yeah, 11600K, like in the i5 range, they've actually managed to improve clock speeds for boost. But, multi-cores, yeah, so got some interesting changes in the clock speeds, which I think indicate some of the silicon behavior. I wouldn't think it's huge differences, but as I said, I think there's a slight frequency advantage on 10th gen, especially when maxed out. Anyway, so 10600K, 10600KF, you can get that for $200, which right now is I think that's a great deal. Isn't that the same price as a Ryzen 3600, except a Ryzen 3600 is just slower than a 10600K? Where is the 3600? It's cheaper than a 3600. If you buy a 3600 for $250, you've made a mistake. Like a major, major mistake. Because like Ryzen 5000 is actually, faster than 10,000 series, depending on the scenario. Ryzen 3000, under most circumstances, actually, I'd say almost all circumstances, is not. So yeah, and the thing is like you might say, but the F doesn't have an iGPU. Like this doesn't have an iGPU either. So I don't know what, like, there's no difference here feature-wise. It's the same feature set, except this is a faster chip. So 10600KF, like, amazing deal right now. 10600K also $220. I would personally go for the 10600KF and buy like a better, spend the extra $20 on a better cooler or a better memory kit or something that actually makes a difference to performance, unless you're using the iGPU features like QuickSync or something, which I've never used that. So yeah, I've heard that that's a thing that people do. That's about as much as I know about it. Anyway, then you have then you have the 11400, which is considered basically to be the only really competitive. Actually, no, not even the 11400. This is dumb. I don't know why you'd spend $190 to get a low clock 6 core when you could get a 10600K for $200. But where is it? 11400F. Yeah. So this is like the celebrated 11th gen CPU, and of course it's out of stock now. I don't know that I would pay $175 for something like that if I can get a 10600KF for 200. Like that's a $25 price gap. This thing has a max boost of 4.4 gigahertz. That like the 10600KF should just like wipe the floor with it. Yeah. I don't know why you'd get an 11400. Absolutely. Yeah, like that's 175. I have no idea why you'd get that at 175. But that is kind of the other CPU in the 11th gen that people consider like good value. So the problem I have with this is like I'm a fan of like we don't have prices for these boards yet, but this is like a $500 board. This is also like a $500 board. I don't know how much this is going to cost. Hopefully it's $500. If there's a decent chance it might cost more. And this is a $320 board, something like that. Where is it? Yeah. I'm really surprised it's 320. I thought it'd be more like 350 or something, but no, it's 320, which is really cool. So, but that's like a $320 board. And then we have this thing, which is, I think, 330. Where is it? Yeah, 330. So, I like my $300 to $500 motherboards because that's where you get the best boards most of the time. But it's like, well, you're not going to stick a $200 10600KF into a $300 Z590 board because that's just not reasonable at all. Because for the money you spend on that board, you could get a 10700K and on a $200 board instead, which is just going to be better because like so basically. My problem with Z590 is we have all these boards that are built for like I'm a big fan of these boards that are designed for CPUs that are like $500 plus. But the $500 CPU is trash. Unless you're on liquid nitrogen, which the vast majority of people aren't. So it's just like I feel like I can easily make an exception for something like a Maximus 13 Apex because like that's an overclocking board. Like, yeah, and even on ambient, the 11th gen is actually pretty fun for competitive overclocking. But for daily, I think it's garbage. I would not build a daily system around an 11900K. Like, why? It doesn't have better gaming performance. It doesn't have better multi-threaded performance unless you're using AVX 512 acceleration. And it's like, seriously, who does that? Right? Like, who uses AVX 512? Like for right now, a lot of people will say the same about AVX, AVX2, but AVX2 is now actually starting to get some adoption. AMD has AVX2 support, like full AVX2 support. AVX2 has been around for a while. And, and also, like, if you do care about AVX 512 support, there's X299. which you can get an 8-core AVX 512 CPU for like $300 from Intel on X299. So I have no idea what what is the purpose of an 11900K? Like from a customer perspective, I have no idea why I would ever want an 11900K. Not at this price point. Like, I think the only way the 11900K would have made any sense is if it was priced similar to a 10700K, because then it's just a straight up, like, almost straight upgrade, right? Because it is not an upgrade to a 10900K. It's like at best, a side grade, at worst, a downgrade. Unless you use the AVX 512 instructions, but then it's like, again, X299 does those better for less. So I still don't know why you'd want an 11900K. And yeah, and that's kind of the thing, is just like so basically for Z590 content, I'm just looking at this like it doesn't make sense to do a daily memory overclock on an 11900K, because you should be running a 10900K, right? Like, why would you, seriously? Like, I don't see a good reason to, like, if a friend came up to me and was like, hey, Buildzoid, build me a gaming system, I'd probably tell him to buy a 10900F. And if he told me he had all the budget in the world, I'd tell him to buy a 5950X. You know, like, there is no scenario in which I would recommend this CPU. Which is like, yeah. Well, if my friend came up to me and said, hey, Buildzoid, I want the record in SuperPi 32 million, then we can talk about getting an 11900K. But under any other circumstances, it's a terrible CPU. Like, it should not be this expensive, anywhere near this expensive. So anyway, yeah, so that's really, really awkward with 11th gen. Like, I do plan to get liquid nitrogen and run 11th gen on liquid nitrogen, but because I do have an 11900K, it's just like I tested it at ambient and I was like, whoa, this clock's worse than my 10900K, and my 10900K isn't great to begin with. So, you know, that's an achievement right there. For core clock, it's worse than my 10900K, and I know somebody else who has a like even worse 11900K, which is just like, well, I mean, that makes sense. Like, these cores are massive. Of course they're gonna clock worse. Like, that's just how that works. More transistors, lower clock speeds. And also sort of more heat density. I think that, well, the heat density thing is interesting, because on paper, the 11900K dedicates the same amount of like millimeters square of silicon to cores that a 10900K does. So the heat density really shouldn't be any higher, but there might be like internal hotspots within the core that are actually like worse on an 11900K than a 10900K. But yeah, so basically on water cooling, I've been completely unimpressed with the 11900K. Like, extremely unimpressed. So yeah, so I basically plan to do a bunch of 10900K stuff with my Z590 boards, because I think that, like, if you want a cool Z590 motherboard for your daily system, you should be buying a 10900K for it, because it's still the best CPU for the LGA 1200 socket, right? Yeah, I know that it sounds ridiculous to say that, but it's just like, I can't justify an 11900K at all, unless you plan to freeze it. But if you're not planning to freeze it, then why are you buying one? It's a terrible chip, and it costs too much. Anyway, so I guess actually, so yeah, so for the high-end motherboards, I think I'm just going to do them in the context of a 10900K for day-to-day usage, because you're not going to, like, don't put an 11900K into your Z590 board. That's dumb. You're making it's just dumb. But there is one downside to the 10th gen compared to the 11th gen on these high-end boards. And it's best illustrated by this block diagram from Gigabyte's Z590 Aorus Ultra motherboard. Motherboard manual. You see, Z590 motherboards have generally 3 M.2 slots. You can also get some boards with 4. And you've got this first M.2 slot, then you've got like a second one over here, and then a third one, you know, or something like that. And the same thing here with this MSI board, right? You've got your first one, second one, third one. There's a couple boards that have 4. The boards that have 4, they're very weird. There's like many different ways that that's implemented, and that's actually like a very important thing to pay attention to if you care about M.2 SSDs. But anyway, the main issue is 10th gen CPUs do not physically have this connector. They do not have the PCIe lanes for M.2 socket 3, M2A CPU as Gigabyte calls it. 10th gen chips do not have the PCIe lanes for that M.2 slot. So if you buy a Z590 motherboard, that first M.2 slot on your motherboard isn't going to work because 10th gen chips don't have support for that M.2 slot. So yeah, that's really awkward. You know, that's kind of awkward with all the Z590 boards. Is like, yeah, if I was like, you know, like as I said, if I was doing a daily system with LGA 1200, I would go old Z590 Aorus Ultra, 109, actually probably 10850K. Depends on what you're aiming for, or 10900KF, like one of these chips. Not the 11900K, like one of the 10 core 10th gen chips. And then like a good kit of RAM, and I'd call it a day. And the only issue is you don't have that first M.2 slot. So, yeah. Now, personally, I don't consider that an issue because I still don't have any M.2 devices, but I do know there's a lot of people out there who like having M.2 devices, and then it's just like, well, I feel very sorry for you that Intel, like, you're forced to buy such a terrible CPU. That's all I can really say. Like, yeah, because your choice is like 11900K or binning rejects. Good, like that's lovely. That's exactly what you want to be buying for your shiny new shiny new desktop. And the thing is, yeah, so that's kind of the biggest problem with 10th gen on Z590 is just like that first M.2 slot isn't gonna work because you don't have the PCIe lanes for it. And yeah, that's really annoying. So, but for the high-end boards, like, I think they make most sense in the context of a 10900K. Like, I don't think there's any way that an 11900K is going to be able to catch up to a 10900K. Because, like, there's a core count difference, there's less L3 cache, and then there's the higher latency memory system, which is just like... So that's... And like, yeah, like in single-threaded workloads where you're not memory-bound, the 11900, or even in memory-bound workloads that are like, you know, like the 11th gen is just weird, right? Because there's like benchmarks like SuperPi, which is like super memory latency intensive, and bandwidth intensive, and 11th gen does great there. But then, you know, if you look at most gaming, well, the thing is that's also on liquid nitrogen, which drastically changes what kind of thing, like what kind of settings you can run. So that's probably a big part of it. But yeah, at ambient, 11th gen is just bad. Anyway, so yeah, so high-end boards, I basically think like 10900K. It's the best CPU on the socket. Like I don't know why you would be, you know, putting a 11900K into your daily system. And then for the lower end boards, right? So we'd be talking like in the $200 price range. So like this right here, or this right here, or this right here. Or even cheaper boards like, well, cheaper boards, those are the out of stock ones. Yeah, but you have, you know, these $200-ish motherboards down here. Yeah, those make sense in the context of like an 11600KF, or actually 11600KF isn't too bad, is it? Yeah, because that's like a $250 CPU. So that's also a solid option, right? 11600K, 11600KF. So yeah, which, like, that is just so awkward. That you get more M.2 slots with like the lower end CPUs. Because like, yeah, because with the 10900, like the 10900K doesn't have the PCIe lanes. Yeah, so that's kind of my thoughts on Z590. is just like and I'm still conflicted about it, right? Like it's just like if you want a high end, like basically the way to treat the Z590 high end is like I want a shiny new high end motherboard for my 10900K. That is the only way the high end Z590 makes sense because like I don't really get why you would spend 11900K money on an 11900K, considering how just uncompetitive that chip is, right? Like, I don't think it's even particularly competitive with a 5800X, right? So if you wanted a different overpriced 8-core CPU, that exists. It's like, oh, the 11900... Actually, the 5800X is still a better option, though, right? Like, yeah, it's also an overpriced 8-core, but at least it's fast, unlike the 11900K. And you'll get all your, you'll have all the M.2 slots in the world, if I remember correctly, right? Yeah. Yeah, so this is like $450, which I still like. I still think I would probably go for, especially if you're not planning to overclock. I think, the non-K Intel chips are like that's you can save $100. To get like you can't, and then you get to the part and you could spend that on your GPU. Oh, you can't. Yeah, making hardware content right now sucks. There's no GPUs. Intel's latest CPUs are like not well. It's like the low end is good. The high end they've completely like screwed it up. Like the high end it's awful. The high end 11th gen chips are just terrible. The low end 11th gen chips are actually kind of competitive. So basically what they should have done is they should never have made like they should have just made like a 6-core die to begin with. So that it would be even because the thing is like I would not be well, it depends what the yields are like, but this is 14 nanometer. They've been on this for ages. Yeah, so arguably it would have been better if they just made a better 10600, like a better 11600 KF instead, a better, cheaper 11600 KF rather than bothering with an 11900K at all, because this chip's just bad, yo. But yeah, so it's like yeah, it's really, really. Like, I'm kind of thinking about what the CPU hierarchy is like right now, and it's like, so at the very tippy top, you'd have like the 5950X for mainstream platforms. We're not going to include high HEDT, right? You'd have the 5950X, which you can't buy. Then you have like the 5900X, which you can't buy. Then you have the 5800X, which you can buy. But the 5800X, I think, depending on what exactly you're doing, you might have a good argument to get a 10900K instead. Because that's a 10 core and this is an 8 core. So again, it's just like if you want more multi-threaded performance, I think the 10900K is faster. Yeah, in brute force multi-threaded workloads, I'm pretty sure the 10900K is faster. So, and then also depending on how much overclocking you want to do, the 10900K can actually end up with just a straight up performance advantage in basically everything against a Ryzen CPU. It's kind of funny, like Intel. Like, I feel like, well, no, 8700K was good, 9900K was okay. 8700K is awesome CPU. 9900K was, if I remember, that came with like a big price bump. Yeah, the price went up a lot. And you did get 2 extra cores, but eh. And then 10900K, same price, but way more cores. Well, another 2 cores, which is nice. So, yeah, so it's like every other chip from Intel is actually kind of cool. But yeah, so 5800X to 900K. Then you've got like the 10900F CPUs. So the lock 10th gen chips. Then you've got like your 10700K, 5600X somewhere. I don't know where you'd rank those. If you want more M.2 SSDs, M5600X, I guess. If you want more CPU power, 10700K. Then you get to like, 11600K, 10600K, and at the very bottom of all of that would be like the Ryzen 5 3600. And below that, I'm not paying attention below that right now. I'd have to think about it, or like do some research and then think about it. Um, I should have written that out. Actually, let's pull up Notepad. I think that'll be kind of just for fun. So my CPU hierarchy right now would be like 5950X, 5900X, 5800X, or 10900K. I guess you could also rank the 850K up here. Also, that's like, I'm going to use spaces for or. So 10900KF, 10850K. Imagine if they did a 10850KF. Imagine that. Like, if that was another $20 off of a 10850K, that would be an insane CPU in terms of, like, performance per dollar. Then you get, like, your 10700K. Actually, wait, I forgot the locked chips. So 10900 or F, 10700K or F. Below that, I guess 5600X. And then like 11600K, 10600K. What? I can't type. This is why I don't do written articles. 10600K. Wait, /F, right? Actually, also like that. And then I guess you get the 11400F, which I'm not sure is that competitive. 10400F. Actually, we're gonna do LGA 1200 and AM4, and I'm gonna, yeah. Cause yeah, 5950. Wait, you can actually buy those for $1,000? Oh, you can. Neat. Like I don't think that's that like. I know it's way over MSRP, but considering what the CPU like, it's like more. It's like twice of 5800X. So I think I'm like kind of okay with that price. It's also true, like yeah, like I'm honestly like it would be better if it was at MSRP, but the fact that you can at least buy one is like, well, at least you can buy one, you know, and it's like it's a fast CPU, so I think this is like, you know, obviously lower prices are better, but like I'm surprised you can get one for $1,000. It's basically what I'm trying to say. Anyway. Yeah, so we can ignore that. I don't know. Well, I guess if you need a ton of multi-thread, well, I know because the 3950X is just straight up slower than a 5900X, right? But or about the same speed, but the 5900X has like a single-threaded advantage. I guess it depends what you're prioritizing. Actually, can you even buy the 3950X right now? Oh, you can. That's not it's not too bad. Here's another dumb CPU. Yeah, this is like a great equivalent to the 11900K. It's like, why would you get a 12 core for like almost the same price as a 16 core? Anyway, that's dumb. Yeah, so there's your 10900K, there's your 5800. Yeah, like they're basically the same price. So that part of the tier list is good enough. Yeah. All right, those three are together, which makes fair enough. Then you've got your 11700K, which is dumb. You've got your 10900, 10900F. I'm like, why would you get a 3800X instead of a 10900? Seriously, like why? I guess it comes with a box cooler, so you can save on that. But yeah, other than that, just why? Also, don't get this. Like, don't. Just don't. Like that's no. Oh, then you've got a 10850K down here. Like, man, the 10850K is so damn cheap. That's ridiculous. And like the 10900 also is ridiculous. That's $350 for a 10 core. What else do you get? So then you get your 1100, 11700, but like that's like and it's clocked even like the clocks are even lower. So yeah, that's a dumb CPU. Mega overpriced 2400 Gs because thank you GPU shortage. 3700X, I don't know why you would get a 3700X instead of a 10700K. The 10700K is just straight up faster. Unless you want the, like, the thing is, the 3700X, you could throw that on, like, a really cheap motherboard, and you do get the box cooler, and the box cooler does a pretty decent job. So yeah, if you're planning to just, like, run the system completely stock, then this is actually a sensible CPU. If you're, you know, more into tinkering, if you're into tinkering with your system, 10700K is better. Yeah, it's still organized. 10700KF, also really, like, actually, like, the funny thing is, like, 10700K, like, that has an iGPU. So if you're waiting to find a GPU in stock somewhere, then this has a pretty significant advantage over a 3700X, assuming you buy a motherboard with a GPU output. You have the 10700KF where you lose the GPU output, but hey, if you have like a spare GPU, which in my opinion, if you're like, I think having at least 2 GPUs that work at any given time is a good idea. Okay? Like your old GPU and your new GPU. Like the GPU you're using and the GPU you can use when your current GPU dies, because GPUs are like components that fail in systems is like motherboards, and because GPUs are basically motherboards, GPUs. Those are like the top 2 things that are probably going to fail in a system. And having spare motherboards around is weird. And motherboards don't really have shortages, but GPUs is like one of those things, like GPU is one of those things that I generally think is a good idea to have a backup GPU. Doesn't need to be fast, just needs to like have a display output so you can still use the computer. Anyway, 3400G is horribly overpriced. Then you have like your 10700. I completely forgot about those. I should have included those in the list. Now, I think the 11, well, depends on what you're doing, I guess. Because with the 11600K, like, you do lose multi-threaded performance, right? Like, that's 33% more cores. You're not making that up. Like, you're not making up for that in, like, overclocking. Like, yeah, it has a K on the end of the name, but it's not going to overclock by 30%. And it's not like this is clocked that far down to be a real problem, but... So, I guess we should include the 10700 here. And again, you know, if you want an iGPU, you have the option of getting an iGPU with it. And then we get the 3600, which I guess you could still make the same argument that I made for the 3700X, where it's like, if you want to run it on a garbage motherboard, it's easier to run. Like, it's really easy to run one of those on a garbage motherboard, but, like, this is, you could, does this not come with a stock cooler? I can't remember. Where can I check that? That is something I've never looked into. Like, whether or not a CPU comes with a heatsink for me is just so not a thing that I think, like, I don't think about that at all. So it's like, I have no idea where you would go check that. I guess we could just go to Newegg and they'll tell us. Does it come with a heatsink? Heatsink and flat fan included. I mean, it's going to be garbage, but it does come with a heatsink, so... And it's not like the heatsink the 3600 comes with is any good. Yeah, like, this, you get a block of metal. Like, you get a block of aluminum with a fan attached, and this, I think, is also a block of aluminum with a fan attached, so... And... Well... You're probably not going to want to enable MCE on the block of aluminum with a fan attached to it, but you can still try. I'm not sure how well that's going to go. But you might be able to get away with like raising the BCLK and keeping the stock power limits in place. So So you get a little bit more single core, like you get a little bit more single threaded performance and lightly threaded performance. But you don't really get any more multi-core because MCE primarily like the where it makes the biggest difference is when you're bouncing off the power limit, which is like all core workloads. So yeah, so I think that this is a totally reasonable alternative to a Ryzen 5 3600, and the 3600 currently just doesn't make a ton of sense. Also, like you can get this with an iGPU, which here you have to get a GPU for a 3600 if you're building a new system because it doesn't have a video out. Then you have your 10600, which dumb because you can get a 10600K for less. And then there's a 10600KF, which I think is out of stock. So yeah, I think, and then you get the like 11400F and the 10400F eventually. So yeah, I think this is a pretty good hierarchy of like CPUs to buy currently, considering current pricing as well. Whoa, this video went really off track. But that's the thing is just like I don't think it's yeah, no, it's fine. We're leaving this up as is. Like I think that's the current CPU hierarchy. And in terms of gaming, like if you're just going for gaming performance, you can stop, like you don't have to go up above that. Like this is like workstation territory. Honestly, I think even the 10 core Intels might be like unnecessarily expensive, depending on what exactly you're playing, but yeah. So 11th gen is like is yeah, not great. I wonder if they could have built like an even higher single-threaded 11600K though. Because if I'm not mistaken, the 11th gen cores are actually like a little bit cut down compared to their 10 nanometer counterparts. Because they couldn't fit, like, because they're too big. So for the 8, like, in order to make the 8 core die, they had to, like, cut something. So they're not exactly the same performance as the 10 nanometer version, if I remember correctly. So, yeah, Intel could have built, like, the greatest 6 core ever, but instead they just built a really bad 8 core. Actually, it's not a really bad 8 core. It's a perfectly good 8 core. It's just a very overpriced 8 core. Right? Like, that's the thing is, like, there's not really any, like, there's no CPU that's just bad. It's just generally too expensive for what it is. Right? So, yeah. That's my thoughts on like I guess current CPU like CPUs currently, motherboards, Z590, 11th gen, 10th gen, Ryzen. It's a real shame that we're getting all these really awesome motherboards on such a like why don't they make these on B550? Right? Like that's a good chipset. That's a great chipset. It's cheap. It's like it's got no M.2s. It's well, no, the actual reason why I like B550 so much is because it's way better at BCLK overclocking than X570. That's literally it. X570 is bad at BCLK. B550 on the other hand is amazing at it. So, yeah, that's the thing is just like I want an Apex on B550. I want a Tachyon on B550. I want an OC Formula on B550. And I want, well, actually, if they could do this on a B550, that would be awesome too. Because, yeah, like, actually, we kind of have this on B5. Well, no, you don't have the safe boot button, though. I'm pretty sure the safe boot functionality is like more an issue of like how AMD's CPUs boot, like the boot up sequence of AMD CPUs doesn't allow for that functionality. Or like it's really like hard to implement or something. Oh, I'm not sure. Like, yeah, I wonder about that because like safe boot is awesome. That's my favorite. Like that's basically my favorite part of all these extreme overclocking motherboards is the safe boot button. It makes memory overclocking so much easier when you don't have to save profiles and clear the CMOS constantly. So, yeah. Anyway, there. I think I should just end this video because it's an hour long. So, well, I've said everything I wanted to say at this point. So if you end up watching my Z590 motherboard PCB breakdowns and I'm talking about the motherboards in the context of a 10900K, it's because I think the 11900K is garbage. Well, I don't think it's actually garbage. Like, it's still not on the level of FX. That's an exaggeration, okay? Like, if this was like the main issue is the price. Like, literally just the price. This is like in my eyes, this is a $350 CPU. And I do realize that it has a ginormous silicon, like the die of a 11900K is huge. I did some pixel counting on it recently. It's like 277 millimeters. So it's like 77 millimeters bigger. And it's like 70 millimeters bigger than a 10900 die, right? Than a 10900K die. So, obviously this thing has to cost more than a 10900K, at least from a like manufacturing cost perspective. But that does not change the fact that this performs like a $350 CPU. It doesn't perform like a $550 CPU, and I'm sorry, Intel. Like, if you're gonna charge something, if you want to charge $550 for a chip, it better have the. I mean, this is not an 11900, so I don't even know why we're there. But yeah, if you want to charge $550 for a chip, it should perform like a $550 chip. You know, not like a $350 chip. Anyway, um, yeah, that's that. Like, that's it for the video. Um, So I guess thanks for watching. Like, share, subscribe. Leave any comments, questions, suggestions down in the comment section below. And if you'd like to support what I do here with actually hardcore overclocking, I do have a Patreon where you can support me directly. And then there's also the AHOC Teespring store where you can pick up shirts, stickers, posters, the usual YouTuber merch. And yeah, that helps immensely with running the channel. So it would be much appreciated if you check the links out in the description. And yeah, that's it. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.